What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for KitGuru, and in this one we're looking at the new Ryzen 9 5980HS mobile processor. So this is one of the new Zen 3 Ryzen 5000 mobile processors from AMD, ready and geared to take the fight to Intel with the Comet Lake H chips. Let's have a look at more of the details in this Asus ROG Flow X13 laptop. Before we do that though, if you like what we do here at KitGuru, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. That really helps us on the YouTube side of things. And make sure you check out the written content on the KitGuru website. That also really helps us out. You can support us even more by checking out our Patreon page and by getting a cool t-shirt like this one from our merch store. Let's get back into it though. The 5980HS is an 8-core 16-thread chip using Zen 3 CPU cores, and it has 8 Vega GPU cores for the APU. The CPU cores operate at a base frequency of 3.0 GHz, and the maximum boost frequency according to AMD is up to about 4.8 GHz, so pretty lofty on the high end there. And it's using a 35-watt TDP. So that's actually cranked a little bit down from the normal H-series parts that we see from AMD and also Intel on the competing side of things. And this is because of the HS design spec, where AMD just reins the TDP in a little bit, sacrifices some of the clock speed, but allows the chip to fit in some very small form factor premium chassis like this 13-inch caliber Flow X13, as opposed to the bigger 14 or 15-inch laptops you typically need for a 45-watt TDP part. There are some under the hood improvements, one of which is to the on-chip voltage and frequency regulation. So AMD now allows the chip to actually manage the voltage and the frequency on a per core basis rather than grouping all the cores together. And another of the key improvements with Ryzen 5000 is CPPC inclusion. We've seen this on the desktop processors, now it's included for Ryzen 5000, and this just allows better clock speed selection and modulation by the processor itself rather than by the perhaps less optimized P states of the operating system. And this, according to AMD, should give you better, as in more accurate, clock speed selection, and it should also help improve battery life because of that. As is usual, because this is a Zen 3 CCX, you get a 16 megabyte slab of L3 cache that is accessible by all 8 cores, and you still get the same half a megabyte of L2 cache per core. The Ryzen 5000 APU's SoC is a 180mm square design with 10.7 billion transistors fabbed on the TSMC 7nm process. Despite the upgrade to the CPU cores, so now we're using Zen 3 instead of Zen 2, and AMD highlighted this was a drop-in replacement because of the way that they designed the Ryzen 4000 SoC with respect to the Zen 2 core. But now you've got Zen 3 cores on the CPU side of things, however you're still using the same Vega cores on the GPU side of the APU. That's a little bit disappointing to many people. Yes, the clock speed has now been boosted to about 2.1 GHz maximum on the higher end chips, but you're still using the older architecture, so that will disappoint some people. Not really an issue in this kind of laptop where you have a dedicated graphics cards, but perhaps for the lower power U-series processors going up against Intel's Tiger Lake chips, that could be an issue. With that said, you do still get pretty decent video decode and video encode capability for just general day-to-day usage of a laptop like this. You can do 4K 60, HEVC, H.264 and VP9 without any problems whatsoever. 8K 60 VP9 through YouTube is too much for this iGPU in our testing, but you can do 8K 30 over YouTube if that's of any interest to you. Anyway, I think that's the key points covered for the Ryzen 9 5980HS for this video. There'll be more details over on the KitGuru website in the written review, but we're now going to get on to the laptops and the testing so we can move swiftly through this. First up on the AMD side of things, we have the Asus ROG Flow X13. Ryzen 9 5980HS, 8-core 16-thread processor, 35-watt TDP, 32 gigs of LPDDR4X memory at 4266 MHz, and a GTX 1650 Max-Q. You get a 1TB SSD, a 62 watt-hour battery, and you get Type-C 100-watt power delivery for charging. That's the bread and butter hardware for the Flow X13. It's a thin and light laptop that's intended to double up as a creator-type powerhouse portable system by day, and then you can extend it to a gaming system by night, but more on that later in the review. As you can see on the table here, we have a few different laptops for the competing comparison configurations. We've got the Core i9-10980HK inside an MSI GS66 Stealth, and this is running at 45 watts long duration power in the balanced mode, and then we also test the extreme mode, which surges up to about 100 watts power for the short duration test, and then about 56 watts power for the long duration. The most notable competitor comes from Intel's Tiger Lake powered Razer Blade Stealth 13. This is using the Core i7 1165G7, which is a quad-core chip running at the 28 watt power mode. So that's about 40 watts power delivery for the initial surge period and about 28 watts power delivery for the long steady state period. And then another notable competitor is the Ryzen 7 4800U inside the Lenovo Yoga Slim 7. Now the 4800U is an 8-core 16-thread chip with an iGPU. It is technically lower power, but you can push the TDP up in the high performance mode on this Lenovo system, and it hovers between about 25 to 35 watts power delivery and about 30 watts on average for the sustained long duration power delivery. So it's a very valid competitor versus the 35 watt 5980HS. If you want more details on all of these test systems and the partnering hardware, then make sure you head on over to the KitGuru website. There's a lot of information, too much to squeeze into this video, so check out the written page on the KitGuru website to see the specs and the details for these systems. It's worth addressing at this point that you may have seen our recent video highlighting some of the weird clock speed behavior with the Asus ROG Flow X13. If you haven't already seen that, make sure you go and check it out, just so you see some of the initial performance and some of the behavior that we initially observed with this laptop. We spoke to AMD about this issue, and it looks like that's down to a laptop MCU firmware, a dodgy firmware quite frankly, that was pushed out over Windows Update, and that realistically in our testing can't really be uninstalled. This looks to be having an effect on some of the inbuilt power modes, the performance and turbo power modes through Armoury Crate, and this is causing some performance headaches and some throttling behavior on the laptop. Now we found that actually you can overcome this issue by basically just flipping the laptop into its tent mode, and once the system understands that the screen has been flipped over, it will actually unlock the power, it seems, and will prevent that throttling. So it does look like an intended control measure for the laptop itself. We actually found that just testing the laptop in our manual power mode in Armoury Crate was absolutely fine, and we didn't see the throttling behavior. And this gives us about 60 to 65 watt short duration initial power boost for the Ryzen 9 5980HS, and then we got the 35 watt nominal TDP long duration power delivery for the chip, which was about 3.3 GHz for all-core loading in the likes of Cinebench. So what I'm basically saying there is that we're happy with the performance data that we got from our sample. It does seem to have this unusual firmware behavior, so make sure if you are seeing behavior like we saw in that other video that you either switch to manual mode or you keep checking back for Windows updates and for updates on the Asus website. But we're happy with the behavior that we saw from the Ryzen 9 5980HS processor. Anyway, I think that covers the main points for the test systems, the test procedures, the behavior, how we tested the Ryzen 9 chip. If you want more details, and there are more details available, head on over to the KitGuru website where you can find all the extra information. And if that's not enough, just ask a question in the comment section down below. Let's jump into the testing. 8 Zen 3 cores running at around 3.9 GHz for the initial 60 watt clock surge deliver a very strong victory for the Ryzen 9 5980HS and Cinebench R20. Intel's power-hungry Core i9 10980HK is beaten by a large 34% margin, and the Flow X13 is over twice as fast as Razer's Intel Tiger Lake competitor. Running 10 minutes of Cinebench R20 multi-threaded rendering back-to-back sees the Flow X13 drop the 5980HS from a 60 watt and 3.9 GHz initial boost clock to around 3.3 GHz at 35 watt steady state. This is far more tolerable from a cooling and power consumption perspective, but the performance drop-off is in the order of a pretty reasonable 10%. 1T scoring of almost 600 points is also chart leading thanks to the 5980HS's rated boost clock of up to 4.8 GHz. Here, the Zen 3 CPU blasts Zen 2 and Comet Lake H competitors, but Intel's Tiger Lake Core i7 1165G7 in the Razer Blade system is only a little slower. The newer Cinebench R23 test delivers basically the same performance trend as R20, but we include this data just in case you're interested for comparison. As is clear, AMD's Zen 3 based Ryzen 9 5980HS is a multi-threaded powerhouse with boost frequencies and IPC strong enough to just about retain chart topping 1T performance. Another convincing performance victory is shown by the Ryzen chip in Blender's quick BMW test. This time AMD's 35 watt TDP processor cuts 10% off the render time compared with Intel's high-powered Core i9 flagship and more than doubles the 28 watt Tiger Lake i7's performance. The Blender Classroom test and its longer runtime gives us a good look at performance after the processor's initial high power and frequency surges. we still see AMD's 5980HS out in front by an increasingly comfortable margin, thanks to the clock speed proficiency at 35 watts steady state package power, which sees all 8 cores running at 3.3 GHz. The moderate runtime of our Handbrake H.264 test sees AMD's Ryzen 9 deliver another crushing victory versus its primary competitors. Prosumers needing video conversion power for on-the-go usage will be far better served by the 8 Zen 3 mobile cores rather than the Tiger Lake quad-core i7-1165 G7, accelerated performance notwithstanding. And the architectural improvements for Zen 3 mean that the 5980HS maintains its chart top in performance position when switched into our Handbrake H.265 conversion. You get roughly double the performance of the 1165 G7 equipped Razer Blade Stealth, but Intel's Tiger Lake CPUs do feature impressive iGPU encode capabilities if your software supports such features. As we are used to at this point, AMD's Zen-based architecture is evidently quick when it comes to 7-zip decompression workloads. That's ideal for anybody dealing with big zipped files on their laptop. The performance lead versus Intel's 10980HK is trimmed heavily when looking at compression, but AMD's 8-core chip partnered with fast LPDDR4X memory does stay out in front. Overall scoring from PC Mark 10 has the Ryzen 9 5980HS equipped Flow X13 laptop in first place. Digging deeper into the individual test results, we see the Ryzen 9 performing particularly well with productivity tasks, though Intel's competitors do put up a good fight thanks to their acceleration capabilities from features such as QuickSync and the stronger GPUs partnering the MSI and Razer laptops. 3D Mark Time Spy has the 5980HS as the highest chip in our chart for CPU scoring. This comes as no surprise given the use of proficient, highly clocked Zen 3 cores. Night Raid shows the same trend, though this less demanding workload widens the Ryzen 9 chip's lead over the 10980HK. If we summarise the performance results thus far, it's clear that the Ryzen 9 5980HS is an absolute performance powerhouse of a CPU. You will note, however, that we haven't shown any GPU-related gaming tests thus far, and that's because the 1650 Max-Q in the Flow X13 is quite frankly just very underpowered compared to the Ryzen 9 5980HS when it comes to gaming. And that's where one of Asus's secret weapons for the Flow X13 ecosystem, if you like, comes in. This is the Asus ROG XG Mobile external GPU dock. So basically, this is a pretty portable, as you can see, external GPU dock that uses a proprietary PCIe Gen 3x8 connector with 100 watts of USB-C power delivery to the laptop. And it gives you extra graphics horsepower for the Flow X13. So inside this unit is a 150 watt rated RTX 3080 mobile laptop caliber GPU. And this is powered by a 280 watt power brick. You get some additional connectivity, you get gigabit Ethernet, you get HDMI, you get DisplayPort, and you get a few USB ports, and you also get an SD card reader. But importantly, you get that 3080 150 watt class graphics horsepower through this dock. So now this is connected via the proprietary connector and it's locked in place. We've got the Ryzen 9 5980HS alongside a proper 150 watt power delivery RTX 3080 laptop GPU, and now we should be able to see some of the proper gaming power from the chip and from this system. Let's dive into it with a comparison versus the Razer Blade Stealth 13 using a Thunderbolt 3 external GPU enclosure with a full-fat desktop RTX 3080 for comparison. Yes, this is perhaps an unfair comparison on a horsepower perspective, but the XG Mobile in 3080 form actually comes in at a pretty ludicrous, quite frankly, $13.99 US. So a Razer Core X Thunderbolt enclosure plus a desktop RTX 3080 or a 6800 XT, if you could ever buy one of those cards again, is probably cheaper than the XG Mobile. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a fair comparison. We're testing the eGPU configurations both using the internal laptop display and using an external monitor. And the reason we're doing this is because Asus highlights that the improved bandwidth of Gen 3x8 for its eGPU dock is actually beneficial, especially when feeding back to the laptop display, because we know that's one of the caveats with Thunderbolt 3 external GPU docks. Despite the proficiencies of the Ryzen 9 5980HS, the Asus ROG Flow X13 is clearly underpowered for ultra preset type gaming in the onboard GPU department with the GTX 1650 Max-Q in F1 2020. Looking at eGPU performance, however, we see the ROG XG Mobile RTX 3080 150 watt chip delivering excellent performance results both with the external monitor and when looped back to the internal monitor. Razer's competing Thunderbolt 3 solution with a full-fat desktop RTX 3080 graphics card is slower as it struggles with CPU horsepower as well as bandwidth when using the 1080p monitor display. GTA 5 still proves itself as an all-round punishing title with IQ settings cranked up. The ROG Flow X13 with its GTX 1650 Max-Q struggles to shine, but clearly lower quality settings will get closer to a 60 FPS average. Switching focus to the eGPU performance, we see the RTX 3080 equipped XG Mobile delivering a solid 60 FPS gaming experience both through the internal and external monitor. The Razer Thunderbolt solution with a full-powered 3080 is quicker when displaying to an external monitor, but bandwidth limitations make it a slower solution for 1080p laptop screen gaming. Notably, however, is the better gaming experience from MSI's GS66 Stealth gaming laptop, despite having technically less powerful graphics hardware in the RTX 2080 Super Max-Q. This is one of the quirks of eGPU gaming. Sometimes technically slower onboard hardware simply performs better than the eGPU solutions. Shadow of the Tomb Raider shows similar behaviour to GTA 5. The fast Ryzen 9 5980HS is hampered by the modestly powered GTX 1650 Max-Q when it comes to high image quality gaming. eGPU performance for both the XG Mobile and the Thunderbolt 3 solutions lags behind MSI's GS66 Stealth with its onboard 2080 Super Max-Q chip. But of the two eGPU solutions, a faster CPU and greater bandwidth allow the Asus solution with the 150W 3080 mobile chip to outperform the 340W RTX 3080 desktop card in our Core i7 powered Razer Thunderbolt 3 comparison. The Division 2 at ultra image quality proves crushing for the 1650 Max-Q of Asus Flow X13, so we cannot really see the Ryzen 9 5980HS shine in that configuration. This time, however, we see more predictable eGPU performance, with Asus's high bandwidth RTX 3080 XG Mobile sitting at the top of the chart and only showing moderate performance loss when driving the internal monitor at 1080p. Razer's desktop RTX 3080 equipped Thunderbolt 3 solution is generally not as good as the Asus alternative for both external and internal monitor usage. That's because the Core i7 1165G7 CPU is undeniably less powerful than AMD's Ryzen 9 5980HS, and therefore the Razer solution struggles with its minimum FPS values in particular, which is also likely related to Thunderbolt 3 bandwidth. Switching focus to 4K gaming performance, we see the desktop caliber RTX 3080 via Razer's Thunderbolt enclosure showing its true muscle versus Asus's laptop grade 3080. The XG Mobile eGPU and Ryzen 9 5980HS solution delivers strong 4K performance to a monitor, but the 4K 16:10 frame rate stability when using the laptop screen is less preferential. Excellent gaming performance from the Ryzen CPU helps Asus's technically less powerful eGPU to deliver a performance victory with GTA 5 on a 4K monitor. Zen 3 works well with GTA 5's processor-hungry engine, so it is not particularly surprising to see the 8-core Zen 3 chip outperforming Intel's 4-core Tiger Lake here. Normal order is resumed in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, with Asus's mobile-grade RTX 3080 eGPU underperforming the full-fat 3080 in the Razer Core X. We still see signs of the AMD CPU's gaming prowess when looking at 1% low FPS values, but it's hard to identify with such vastly different graphics configurations. The 150W XG Mobile solution loses again in the Division 2, and this time by a wide margin. Even the gaming grunt of the Zen 3 CPU inside the Flow X13 cannot save the Asus solution's overall performance versus the Razer Thunderbolt alternative. So I think the summary there is that the XG Mobile actually does deliver a strong and quite impressive actually performance boost versus the internal GPU and even versus the Thunderbolt 3 system when it comes to 1080p gaming, especially for internal monitor and external monitor gaming, where the horsepower of the CPU inside the Flow X13 is important and the bandwidth is important. But when you do crank up the graphics load, the significantly more powerful desktop class GPU through the Thunderbolt solution can give stronger performance despite the far inferior Tiger Lake chip inside the Razer system compared to the Zen 3 chip inside the Asus laptop. If we start off the conclusion with some quick feedback on the device housing the Ryzen 9 5980HS processor that we're specifically interested in, the Asus ROG Flow X13 laptop, then I have pretty strong praise for it overall actually. This is a form factor of laptop and a design of laptop that realistically these new Ryzen 9 chips, especially the HS series chips, have actually made possible. That's a strong positive for both Asus and AMD, the work that they've done to make this possible. The laptop itself is sleek, it's well built, and it's clearly very portable with our 13.4-inch 16:10 screen and 13-inch form factor. And the battery life was perfectly fine for my testing. About 6 hours according to the PC Mark 10 benchmark test for battery life. And then I also had no problems with the cooling either. The cooling solution itself is actually very proficient when it comes to sheer temperature control and also a balance with noise output. And of course this varies depending on the Armoury crate profile that you're using, but I must say I was actually very happy with the cooling overall. I will say that I would have liked the Flow X13 to have at least one more USB-A port, and I think Asus kind of cheaped out a bit on the SSD. They should be having a higher performance SSD from the likes of perhaps Samsung or one of the higher end WD models, so it seemed a bit needless. But the 32 gigs of LPDDR4X memory certainly kept my million tab Chrome usage perfectly happy throughout. Of course, the other key point is the underpowered GTX 1650 Max-Q graphics card that goes alongside the really powerful Ryzen 9 chip, but that's where the Asus ROG XG Mobile eGPU dock comes in. So while this did add a significant performance boost for gaming usage and obviously GPU compute usage, it does come with some of its own caveats, namely the expense. If you're going for this combination, it's going to be roughly £2,900 or a little bit more in the UK, which is just very, very expensive. And while I do quite like the XG Mobile dock, I respect what it does, especially in the form factor that Asus achieves, and I like the innovation, I just would have liked to see the Thunderbolt ecosystem used versus this proprietary, non-upgradable, expensive solution. But if you disagree with that, let me know in the comment section down below. The laptop itself, if this 32 gig 4K screen Ryzen 9 5980HS model comes in at about £2,000, that's going to be a really competitive machine for the horsepower that it offers. If we now focus on the Ryzen 9 5980HS, basically it's a fantastic performer that offers a new level of CPU grunt in these 13-14-inch form factor laptops. I think realistically the Ryzen 9 5980HS is in general a far better solution than the competing 8-core H-series Comet Lake models from Intel, and it performs significantly better. You're talking levels of 30% plus higher often, even though it's running at a lower TDP level versus the Intel chip. So that's a really, really strong victory for the 5980HS in general. Of course, it's not all plain sailing though. AMD is still using the older Vega architecture for the iGPU, which is pretty disappointing, specifically from a media encode-decode perspective when you're looking at the comparison to Tiger Lake, which has a really strong media encoder and media decoder. And it's also still disappointing to see AMD using PCIe Gen 3 when the rest of the ecosystem on the desktop is basically PCIe Gen 4, as is Tiger Lake from Intel. And I'm going to go out and say AMD laptops really do need to find a way to compete with the Thunderbolt ecosystem on the Intel side of things. So the Ryzen 9 5980HS is an absolutely fantastic solution that really does deliver storming performance in a 35-watt TDP. It delivers obviously plenty of cores, plenty of cache, really good clock speeds, pretty much a far superior solution to the Core i9 10980HK because it offers better performance overall and in general and is significantly lower power consumption. I've been Luke Hill for KitGuru. Thank you for watching this video review of the Ryzen 9 5980HS processor inside the Asus ROG Flow X13 laptop. Let us know what you think in the comment section down below. Are you impressed by the level of compute performance on offer by the Ryzen 9 5980HS? Would you consider a laptop like this for your daily usage because you get so much performance squeezed into this form factor? Or are you slightly disappointed to see the lack of PCIe Gen 4 and Thunderbolt, for example? Let us know in the comment section down below. If you like this video, give us a like, hit the subscribe button on the YouTube channel, that really helps us out. Make sure you check out the written page on the KitGuru website, there's more details over there and that really helps us support the channel also. And you can support us even more by checking out our Patreon page and by buying a cool t-shirt like this from our merch store. See you in the next one.